Well, it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Christopher Benfey, who is Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English at Mount Holyoke College. He is the author of books that reanimate the American Gilded Age, including The Double Life of Stephen Crane from 1992, The Great Wave, Gilded Age Misfits, Japanese Eccentrics, and The Opening of Old Japan, in which Frank Lloyd Wright makes several appearances. In addition, a Summer of Hummingbirds, and most recently, 2019, If, the Untold Story of Kipling's American Years. Chris is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So this afternoon, he begins our symposium with exactitude and the weather. Chris?
Thank you, Michael. Often considered my living twin at Mount Holyoke. And thank you, Perry and Laure, all three of you, for the incredible work we all know you've put into this symposium. I'll be speaking for about 30 minutes, and I will not be using images, so this is the time when you can rest your eyes before the long Zoom marathon that we're going to have here. You can do the dishes, treat me like a podcast. So my title today is Exactitude and the Weather. And I take my epigraph from Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. Gwendolyn says, "Please don't talk to me about the weather. Whenever people talk to me about the weather, I always feel that they mean something else." So to begin, I have been listening to Mozart, the old physicist said, as he welcomed us into his ugly split-level house in Greensboro, North Carolina. He had an LP, a red Columbia vinyl disc on the record player. It was one of the late piano concertos, and we all stopped for a moment in the living room, taking in the music. This happened 40 years ago. I don't remember the physicist's name. I don't remember what we ate, but I do remember my impression of the music. It was sumptuous like red velvet, but also precise, intricate. I remember one other thing from that evening. It was something the old physicist said. The weather had come up, the subject people talk about when there's nothing else to talk about. What the old physicist said that stormy night in Greensboro, North Carolina, was this: meteorology is not an exact science. The old physicist's remark about the limits of meteorology was not original with him. A Google search identifies it as an old adage, so familiar and so widely used that no source is given. But it was new to me. And what made it memorable was the confluence of two forces, the intricacy and exactitude of Mozart and the imprecision, the unpredictability of meteorology. Or to give the opposition another name, exactitude and the weather. I want to assemble some evidence today that it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to come to grips with the notion of exactitude, the topic of our symposium, without wrestling with its various opposites, its discontents. It may even be the case that the quest for exactitude invites its opposites onto the scene, like the uninvited guest in a fairy tale. High on the list of these enemies of exactitude, at least as far as architecture is concerned, is the weather. No matter how precisely the building plans are drawn on paper or on the computer screen, weather has a way of making itself a conspicuous, if generally uninvited, part of the proceedings. The life of buildings in time is how Mohsen Mostafavi and David Leatherbarrow subtitled their 1993 book, On Weathering. The implication is that however ideally, with whatever imagined exactitude, buildings exist in space, they must also exist in time, and hence in a world of incessant change and even mortality. It is within that radically unideal realm of time and change that the weather works its menace. In architecture, Mostafavi and Leatherbarrow write, quote, "The gradual destruction of buildings by nature in time is weathering." In an era of rapid climate change like our own, we may have to modify their formulation about the gradual destruction of buildings by nature in time. How quaint it sounds looking back from our vantage point in 2020 to refer to the gradual destruction of buildings by nature. In her recent book, The Ruins Lesson, the poet and literary critic Susan Stewart goes deeply into the question of buildings destroyed over time. Stewart moves beyond the customary analysis of the cultural taste for ruins in, for example, Piranesi or Wordsworth, arguing instead that all artistic creation is built in some sense on the ruins of the past. Contemporary sonnets are built on the ruins of previous sonnets. And on the topic of weather, Stewart stresses not gradual change, but violent, drastic, immediate change. And I quote, "Persons and things can be slowly ruined by suffering the depredations of use and ordinary weather. And in times of violence and extreme weather, they can be actively ruined," end of quote. Welcome to extreme weather, she seems to say, fires and floods, tornadoes and hurricanes, our present and our future. One strategy adopted by architects faced with extreme weather, as I hardly need to remind this audience, has been to develop ever more weather-resistant materials, stainless steel, reinforced glass, protective paints, and so on. We might think of this as constituting an architecture of climate change denial. A very different strategy has been to embrace the natural effects of weathering over time, to allow for them, to welcome them, and even to plan for them. For if there is menace in weathering, especially in extreme weathering, there can also be magic. A major aim of Mostafavi and Leatherbarrow's book is to recover a positive contribution from the weather, to view what time does to a building as occasionally, and even in certain cases deliberately, an enhancement rather than a diminution. Quote, "In the mathematics of the environment," they write, "weathering is a power of subtraction, a minus, under the sign of which newly finished corners, surfaces, and colors are taken away by rain, wind, and sun. But is weathering only subtraction? Can it not also add and enhance? Creation in this sense is the work of an architect and builder, anticipating the work of the elements," end of quote. Of course, whole aesthetic systems, like the Japanese concept of wabi, or the Roman taste for moldering walls, so dear to Leonardo da Vinci and to Cy Twombly, can be based on this aesthetic partnership with weathering and time. Even whole art forms, like wood-fired ceramics, arise from a deliberately contrived confluence of the ancient natural elements of earth, air, fire, and water. The wood-fired kiln introduces the quintessential fifth element of chance, producing those uninvited accidents that are the glory of much Japanese pottery associated with the tea ceremony. The whole process of creating wood-fired ceramics is like an allegory of surviving and thriving amid the violent and unpredictable vicissitudes of climate change. It is particularly interesting to see the opposition of exactitude and the weather emerging in aesthetic traditions in which a high finish of craftsmanship, of precision, is treasured and even demanded. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the Japanese novelist Junichiro Tanizaki's beautiful essay on Japanese aesthetics, In Praise of Shadows, from 1933 to 34. In his attempt to define a distinctively Asian aesthetic, in contrast to supposed Western values of clarity, direct light, and stainless steel, Tanizaki evokes the high finish of Asian craftsmen and architects working in lacquer and jade before zeroing in on his real interest, what time and the weather do to human artifacts. And I quote, "We do love things that bear the marks of grime, soot, and weather," Tanizaki writes. "And we do love the colors and the sheen that call to mind the past that made them." In this case, the past refers for Tanizaki both to the human makers and to the by turns destructive and aesthetically enhancing work of time. This Japanese love of the stained, the damaged, and the imperfect goes back many centuries to writings like the 14th century court official and Buddhist monk Yoshida Kenko, whose essays in idleness define, like Tanizaki, a combination of exact workmanship and damage. Somebody once remarked, Kenko writes, that thin silk was not satisfactory as a scroll wrapping because it was so easily torn, to which Kenko replies, "It is only after the silk wrapper has frayed at top and bottom and the mother of pearl has fallen from the roller that a scroll looks beautiful." Kenko then quotes another authority who wrote, quote, "Even when building the imperial palace, they always leave one place unfinished." The Buddhist tolerance of evanescence is evident in these passages, of course, but perhaps there is a more subtle aversion to the perfected, the complete, the exact. For me, the most beautiful invocation of this aversion to perfection comes from the American poet, the New England poet, Wallace Stevens. I am thinking especially of, quote, "The Poems of Our Climate," a wonderful short poem of 1942. I'm particularly struck by the title with its emphasis on the weather. Wallace Stevens, whom Calvino in his Exactitude memo categorizes as a poet of crystalline precision, begins his poem with an image of perfection, of exactitude, and I quote, "Clear water in a brilliant bowl, pink and white carnations, the light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow." Stevens in this poem identifies exactitude with coldness. The light in the room is like snowy air. The porcelain, that material of Asian perfection, is cold. The enemies of exactitude, by contrast, are summoned from our own hotter emotional needs. Stevens was himself a passionate student of Stevens was a passionate student of Asian aesthetics, and his ending to the Poems of Our Climate is another hymn to imperfection in the Japanese mode, and I quote, "The imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, delight, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds." Just to repeat, delight lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. For Stevens, who spent his life in the Connecticut River Valley, weather is both metaphor and reality. In the Poems of Our Climate, perfection is identified with winter, a crystalline coldness indistinguishable from death. In such a perfected world, heat is life because, quote, the imperfect is so hot in us. Italo Calvino already foresaw this dialectic of exactitude and its opposites in the text from which this symposium draws its theme. Quote, every concept and value turns out to be double, he writes, even exactitude. Calvino then proceeds to quote a passage from his novel, Invisible Cities, that would seem the very essence of geometric exactitude, an evocation of a game of chess. But it is the weather and weathering that immediately takes over. Your chessboard, Marco Polo observes, is inlaid with two woods, ebony and maple. The square on which your enlightened gaze is fixed was cut from the ring of a tree that grew in a year of drought. You see how its fibers are arranged? Here, a barely hinted knot can be made out. A bud tried to burgeon on a premature spring day, but the night's frost forced it to desist. In the final half of this talk, I want to give glancing attention to two other literary figures, both of whom were invoked in Calvino's Exactitude memo. One is the French poet, essayist, and mathematician Paul Valéry, to Americans, Paul Valery, and the other is the American writer Edgar Allan Poe, to the French Edgar Poe. In our century, Calvino writes, Paul Valéry is the one who has best defined poetry as a straining after exactitude. Calvino traces a poetics of exactitude, as he calls it, in a straight line from Valéry back to his own master, Mallarmé, already cited twice in this symposium, and then further back to Baudelaire, and finally to Baudelaire's own great predecessor, Edgar Allan Poe. In Poe, as Calvino notes, Valéry saw le démon de la lucidité, the demon of lucidity, and, quote, the literary engineer who studied and utilized all the resources of art. Poe famously claimed in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, that at no point in the writing of his poem, The Raven, was anything left to accident or intuition. Instead, Poe insists, and I quote, the work proceeded step by step to its completion with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. It is this side of Poe that so appealed to Valéry, who abandoned poetry for 20 years to pursue his mathematical interests. It is also the side of Poe that appeals to Calvino himself. And yet, in a familiar pattern, a pattern that I'm tracing in this talk, the search for exactitude in Poe's poems and stories inevitably seems to summon its opposite, the workings of time and the weather. These themes in Poe's work seem to arise from some repressed region of the mind or of the climate. Here one might suggest that the proper literary mode of weathering is in fact the Gothic, the mode in which Poe is best known. I am thinking here, of course, of Poe's lurid story of Gothic horror, creepy doppelgangers, incest, and architecture, The Fall of the House of Usher. Today, I wish to tease out just one thematic thread from the preposterously complex thematic weave of the story, namely the tension between exactitude and its opposites, specifically in relation to architecture. Roderick Usher, seemingly the sole occupant of his moldering hereditary palace until his mortally ill sister and identical twin, indeed his exact replica, appears on the scene, is portrayed as a demon of lucidity, given to mathematical calculations, fantastical architectural designs, and the intricacies of music. Usher, we are told, is an artist and a designer of abstract spaces, phantasmagoric conceptions, as the narrator refers to them, most conspicuously of a great underground vault destined, apparently, for his twin sister's entombment. And I quote, "A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel with low walls, smooth, white, and without interruption or device," end of quote. No source of light is discernible in this phantasmagoric work, but as in those ghostly interiors of James Turrell or Tadeo Ando, quote, "A flood of intense rays rolled throughout and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor." The house in which Usher lives, the famous House of Usher itself, shows the marks of what time does to architectural designs. Quote, "Its principal feature seemed to be that of an excessive antiquity," Poe's narrator remarks. "The discoloration of ages had been great." He then points out that there are minute fungi covering the whole exterior. And yet he also insists that there's a certain aesthetic clash in the appearance of the house. Twice Poe invokes inconsistency as a key feature of the house's design. Quote, "No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between the still perfect adaptation of parts and the utterly porous and evidently decayed condition of the individual stones." Here we can discern that same tension between exactitude, the still perfect adaptation of parts, and the weather with its stain and decay. In Roderick Usher himself, the doomed musical prodigy and fantastical architect, the narrator discerns a related inconsistency. Quote, "In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome an habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation." So this repeated use in the Poe story of the concept of inconsistency, and indeed the word inconsistency. The word inconsistency is a reminder that Calvino's final unwritten lecture, his sixth memo, was to be about the aesthetic concept of consistency. There's a certain charm, a fitting ending in this missing sixth memo for the next millennium, the millennium in which we have already lived for 20 years. You will remember the 14th century Buddhist priest Kenko invoking the imperial palace in which one portion is left unfinished. Kenko also says in both Buddhist and Confucian writings of former times, there are also many missing chapters. So I want to conclude by circling back to Paul Valéry, the poet who, according to Calvino, quote, "best defined poetry as a straining after exactitude." In 1921, in response to an invitation like this one, an architecture symposium, Valéry published a remarkable essay on architecture in the form of a Socratic dialogue called Eupolinus, or The Architect. The essay has come to have a certain weight of finality in the history of modernism for two reasons. A German translation of the essay was the last major work of the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, and a preface to the English translation of Valéry's essay was the last major work of Wallace Stevens. Eupolinus is set in the afterworld as bodiless Socrates and his younger friend Phaedrus, also bodiless, debate the essence of architecture. Socrates associates architecture with music as two essentially non-mimetic arts that, as he puts it, borrow a minimum from natural objects. Twice in the essay, the two speakers take up the question of how a building can sing. And Socrates, reversing the metaphor, describes music as a mobile edifice, in French, un édifice mobile. As they cast about for a perfect example of music as architecture or architecture as music, Phaedrus quotes extensively from an acquaintance of his, a master architect named Eupolinus. And Eupolinus's quintessential building, itself a mobile edifice, is in fact a ship. And it is precisely here in Valéry's dialectical scheme that meteorology enters the picture. For Eupolinus's ship, in its quest for lastingness, is so closely congruent with weather, with the climatic forces, that it essentially becomes the weather. He would passionately imagine the nature of the winds and the waters, Phaedrus says of Eupolinus, the mobility and the resistance of their floods. He would ponder upon the birth of tempests and calms, the circulation of warm currents. He would consider the whims and veerings of the breezes, end of quote. Eupolinus, he notes, thought that a ship should in some sort be created by the knowledge of the sea, should almost be fashioned by the very wave itself, end of quote. One can see here emerging a sufficiently familiar theme from the Bauhaus or from Frank Lloyd Wright, that form should follow function. And I quote, "It sometimes used to seem to me that an impression of beauty was born of exactitude," Phaedrus remarks. "It sometimes used to seem to me that an impression of beauty was born of exactitude, and that a sort of delight was engendered by the almost miraculous conformity of an object with the function that it must fulfill." But what I take from Valéry's essay is a more radical insight, a leap from his notion of music as a mobile edifice to a vision of a truly mobile architecture. For at the heart of this essay lies an inkling that the future of the human race and of the planet on which we live lies in mobility and in mobile edifices that take their promptings from wind and wave. The weather in Valéry's vision is no longer an enemy to be outflanked by ever more resistant materials. Instead, the weather is seen as a necessary partner, an inspiration in our architectural endeavors. Our homes have always been, in a sense, mobile homes, perched precariously on this spinning planet racing through space. But they will have to be even more closely adapted to the weather, eventually becoming like Eupolinus's ship, the wind and waves themselves. To vary the quote often attributed to Gandhi, "We ourselves must be the change we want to see in the world," including climate change. For if there is to be any lastingness in these perilous times, for us and for our planet, our edifices must ever more perfectly partake of the unpredictable vicissitudes of climate. In the face of climate change, the ravages of time and the shortness of available time are consistently on our minds. We must strive for exactitude on our data and in our forecasts, but also learn to accommodate with time and the weather. For as the old physicist told me 40 years ago, meteorology is not an exact science. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was just great. Are there I'm trying to access the Q&A, but can't.
I think you might want to ask the first question, Michael, while we're waiting for questions to come.
Okay.
Question.
We're going to ask, do you see, just what occurred to me here is, do you see humor in architecture as, again, one of the possible flip sides or opposites of exactitude and what seems to be the rigor and seriousness? I mean, one perhaps can find a kind of in thread of humor running through, a lot of architecture, from, misplaced, deliberately misplaced mosaic tessera in an otherwise elaborately exact pattern, or more, I guess, egregiously, some of the work of Frank Gehry that seems deliberately to thumb its nose at precision and exactitude.
Yeah, I love that idea. There may be a suggestion that that the postmodern tends to take an ironic glance at the past. I invoke Susan Stewart's book about ruins, and it's a very serious book. But I think of Piranesi, for example, as having an enormous amount of humor amid his prisons and his that there is something in the awareness of building on the past, building on ruins that can, in the right temperament, invite wit and humor. It may at times be a kind of gallows humor. After arguing across 20 pages why The Raven is such a perfect poem, Poe said it's perfect in length, it's perfect in topic, the most beautiful subject is the death of a beautiful woman, and we all think, oh God, and perfect in its refrain, no other word would work better than nevermore. But then Poe appends a note to the top of the poem, and he says, you may notice that the poet has achieved some novel effects of the ludicrous, in addition to the great originality of the work. So I like that, and through the whole Zen tradition, which I also invoke, there is the evanescence of life is the mortality we all face, is met with a kind of deflection and wit and amusement and wryness, and it is the very quest for lastingness in the sense of rigidity, armor. We will fight the weather. We will fight death. That is held up for derision and for humor.
Right. Yes. It perhaps, called to mind a little bit, I guess there was at least a reported encounter between Frank Lloyd Wright and Philip Johnson at Johnson's Glass House, in which Johnson had, again, you look at that house and there's just not, a bolt or out of place. It's just, kind of perfect object, but it leaks. The weather comes in. And Johnson had buckets arrayed around the interior, and Wright looked at it and said, what, Philip, you've only got 2 buckets? To be a proper work of architecture, you need at least 4. So
just 2. I don't think of Wright as a brilliant humorist, and that has the if it were flipped and someone made the same joke about him, I think he would have shot the visitor. Yeah, I mentioned Wallace Stevens's interest in Japanese aesthetics. He was a passionate reader of the Book of Tea, Okakura Kakuzo's introduction for Americans to the tea ceremony, and Frank Lloyd Wright said he first found his concept of the architecture from within by reading the Book of Tea. There's a great episode, I'm sure everyone remembers some version of this, but Okakura tells a story of a Zen master teaching his acolyte to take care of the garden, and the acolyte sweeps everything totally clean, and the gravel is pristine, and everything is in its place. And he says, "Master, have I done well?" And the master says, "All but one thing," and he yanks at a tree branch, and 5 leaves fall down, and the master says, "Now, it's perfect." So that's a little the story of the buckets again.
Right.
Chris, may I ask you a question?
I wish you would. This is your territory, the tradition from Baudelaire to
Baudelaire,
Valéry.
Valéry, Mallarmé,
That's right.
all my favorites. Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I had a question, like towards the end of your talk, you said the future lies in mobile edifices. The weather should be a partner, inspiration. You had this kind of beautiful image of a building becoming the wind and waves themselves. But just thinking about contemporary events, it seems like all these, catastrophic weather events that have been happening have created a little bit the opposite impression that there's a lot of fighting the weather that's been happening instead of sort of incorporating into building. Is there a way to reconcile what you're proposing to work with the weather as a partner while adjusting to sort of contemporary catastrophic events?
Yeah, I'm probably the very last person to ask, and there are 50 people in the room who can answer that question better than I am. And I'm looking forward to Alejandro's talk after this one, in which I think he will be addressing some of these issues, that cities may be the wrong armor against catastrophic climate change. Yeah, I mean, I took myself, to borrow Michael's term, a little bit of a lightweight approach to issues that are absolutely terrifying. And I don't mean to suggest that we can just become climate change and everything will be great. But my instinct is again that rigidity in the face of fire, flame, wave, wind, is not going to be the answer. Building up bigger and bigger walls, for example, as Robert Frost famously said, "Good fences make good neighbors," but then he immediately said, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." we kind of know what that something is. So I think I imagine that over the next 2 days we're going to hear a lot of sophisticated architectural answers to your question. I was just consistently surprised in digging in your territory to find how many of these writers have used metaphors drawn from architecture, have actually been rather specific in trying to imagine buildings. Edgar Allan Poe also has a rather remarkable essay called "The Philosophy of Furniture," in which he. So these are, these writers are very. There is obviously, I mean, we mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright before, a demon reader of sources that work for him. There's a lot of back and forth between architects and poets on these very issues.
And I find it fascinating that you're connecting them through the weather, as a kind of bridge. Michael mentioned the idea of an emergency bridge, which is from Calvino, words being
Yes,
like an emergency bridge thrown over the abyss. And you seem to be using the weather as a force that brings sort of architecture and language, poetry together.
Yeah, we could probably figure out a way to control the weather, but that would, any time I hear discussions of how humans can do a better job of controlling the weather, it terrifies me. I mean, obviously, we can do things that would lessen the extremity of weather, but cloud seeding and all of the other ways to reduce meteorology to an exact science are somehow even more terrifying than. Yeah, I like the idea of building the bridge.
Thank you. Thanks,
I
Chris.
think we have one question from the audience, and then I'll ask a question of mine if we do have time, or maybe an observation. But I'm going to do that from now on, and I think that for this one is okay. But if the audience would like to ask questions anonymously, you can do it. And if not, I will read your name and read your question. And our first question of the day is by Cami. And Cami is asking, are you suggesting that the current philosophy of architecture is one in which we build shields against nature rather than embedding ourselves in it?
So again, I'm the wrong person to suggest what today's view among architects is. You broadly are the architects. I mean, there are many in the audience, some of whom I know. I guess what I am suggesting is an opposition or a dialogue about architecture with armor and defense and rigidity and unaccommodating ways to address the weather, and something more like what the Japanese or Chinese call ju, a kind of a softness like jujutsu or judo. So yeah, I mean, I also see in these writers this. It also is in the Tao Te Ching, the idea that it's the tree that yields that survives, and not the tree that is rigid and strong. And God, I'm tempted to say that this is also so clear in our politics, but we're trying to keep that out of the. But the idea of strength and manliness and like no, not that. Something more yielding and flexible and accommodating. Yeah.
We actually have two more questions, and we're getting very close to the next presentation. Michael, would you like to read the next question?
Yes, this was more of a comment, I think, the next one. But the question, again, we're going to ask you to, range far and wide, Chris, in the architectural landscape. Do you think that the destruction of biodiversity in our time will result in a culture and aesthetic that embraces the impermanence of human shelter?
Yeah. Yes.
Very exact. Very exact.
Yes, I mean, my just quick stray thought is that we probably need a better word than ruin. That ruin is itself, in Georg Simmel and all of these great that ruin itself is a sort of word of mourning, of lament, of subtraction, and I like the questioner's impermanence. I think impermanence or imperfection. We probably need a way to banish the whole concept of ruin, or we will just be depressed and think of the world as one of how we need to preserve, and that's, we're all done with preservation. We're all done with that.
There's one last comment which we should probably read for you, and then we will thank you and move to the next presentation. It says, thank you for your talk. I enjoyed your take on the inexact and think that the weather is in so many ways a metaphor for the unpredictable human behavior and perception too. Control of these things is a harder and perhaps more dangerous job.
Yes, yes, that's very good. I mean, a lot of the metaphors over time for our moods are drawn from the weather, these inner storms and dry winds that blow through our brains and our imaginations. Yeah, I mean, just yes. The looseness of my talk is because I allowed myself to think both metaphorically about the weather, but also about its true force and existence. But that's a lovely comment. Thank you. And thank you all. Those are wonderful, impossible questions.
Thank you
so
so much.
Thank you.